The hum of the Luminara's sterilization fields was the only sound in the pristine common area until Caleb Marner sneezed. It wasn't just any sneeze. It was a thunderous, messy, unrestrained explosion of sound and droplets that reverberated off the metallic walls. Every Shurian in the room froze mid-motion. Their coppery orange antennae snapped toward him in synchronized alarm, quivering like tuning forks. Caleb sniffled, then wiped his nose on his sleeve with all the grace of a barnyard animal. He took another sip of water, utterly unfazed. Human Marner came a strained voice from his left. Zariah, a junior medic, had backed up against the far wall, her copper-colored antennae folded tight to her scalp in a posture of deep unease. Her portable environmental scanner emitted a shrill alarm, its display awash with angry red warnings. "Are you aware," she said, her tone trembling, "that you've just aerosolized particulate matter?" Caleb blinked at her, nonchalant. Yeah? It's a sneeze. Happens when you've got a cold." Zariah's golden skin paled to a sickly silver as she stared at the scanner. Elevated nitrogen oxides, humidity imbalance, particulate matter consistent with, she gasped audibly, pathogenic contamination. Caleb shrugged, then rubbed the back of his neck. "Right, like I said, cold." Zariah pressed a button on her comm unit with shaky fingers, her wide, triangular pupils flicking nervously toward Caleb. "Dr. Velran," she whispered into the device, "this is an emergency. Human Caleb Marner is exhibiting symptoms." "Symptoms," the comm unit crackled with Velran's sharp voice. "Specify." Zariah hesitated, glancing at Caleb, who had leaned back in his chair and was casually massaging his temples. Multiple exhalatory events. Elevated nitrogen oxides in the immediate atmosphere. And she glanced at the scanner again, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "His body temperature is rising." There was a brief, ominous silence on the other end of the comm. "I am on my way," Velran said curtly. Within minutes, the doors to the common area slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and Dr. Velran swept into the room, his segmented fingers clicking rhythmically against his datapad. His pale blue skin darkened slightly as his antennae flared in irritation. Zariah met him halfway, thrusting her scanner toward him like it might shield her from contagion. "Doctor, his vitals are," she hesitated, visibly unsettled, erratic. Velran took the scanner, his triangular pupils narrowing as he scanned the data. Elevated nitrogen oxides, increased respiratory particulates, measurable heat output from his dermis. His voice tightened. "And his body temperature is -39.8 degrees Celsius." Zariah finished grimly. "It's still climbing." Velran's antennae stiffened. "Nearly 3 degrees above baseline? That would indicate thermoregulatory failure in most species." He turned sharply toward Caleb, who now had his eyes closed, his head tilted back against his chair. "Human, you are febrile, tachycardic, and possibly hypercapnic. Explain yourself." Caleb opened one eye lazily, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Oh, hey, Doc. Didn't see you there. You're looking extra grumpy today." Velran's segmented fingers twitched against his datapad. "This is no time for levity. Your vital signs indicate systemic stress bordering on organ failure. Your body temperature alone." Caleb waved a hand dismissively. "Relax. It's just a fever. Happens all the time back home. I'll drink some water, take a nap, and I'll be fine." Velran blinked, his antennae twitching in disbelief. "You are suggesting that this hypermetabolic stress is routine?" "Pretty much," Caleb said with a shrug. "Humans are built for this kind of thing." "Built?" Velran echoed, incredulous. He turned sharply to Zariah. "Protocol B7. Isolate him immediately." Zariah faltered. "Dr. I." Now Velran barked, and Zariah jumped into action, her fingers dancing over the interface of her scanner. Hold on, Caleb protested, raising both hands in mock surrender. "You don't need to bust out the hazmat suits. I'm not spewing acid or anything. It's just a cold." Velran turned on him, his segmented arms crossing tightly over his chest. Human, you are a walking biohazard. Your presence may already be compromising every controlled environment on this vessel. Do not attempt to downplay your condition. Before Caleb could respond, the doors hissed open again, and two Shurian medics entered in sleek silver biosuits. Without a word, they advanced toward Caleb, their movements efficient and deliberate. "Oh, come on," Caleb groaned as the medics guided him to his feet. "This is overkill, don't you think? It's not like I'm radioactive." Velran's triangular pupils narrowed sharply, restraining him to a diagnostic platform. His delusional behavior suggests secondary neurological complications. Caleb sighed dramatically but didn't resist as the medics led him toward the medical bay. "You know," he muttered over his shoulder, "this is why no one likes going to the doctor." As the doors slid shut behind him, Velran turned to Zariah. "Current body temperature." 39.9, she said quietly, "and rising." Velran stood still for a moment, his antennae stiff with tension. Finally, he muttered, "How does such a fragile species survive its own biology?" The Luminara's medical bay hummed with quiet urgency. Caleb Marner lay sprawled on a diagnostic platform, his skin flushed and his shirt damp with sweat. Monitors flickered above him, displaying a cascade of numbers and graphs. Two silver-suited medics hovered nearby, their rigid posture betraying their unease. Chief Medical Officer Velran stood at the edge of the platform, his segmented fingers moving rapidly over a holographic console. Zariah, her coppery antennae twitching nervously, peered at her scanner as it chimed with alerts. "Core temperature now at 40.3 degrees Celsius, Zariah reported, her voice tight. Heart rate, 132 beats per minute. Respiratory rate, 28 per minute. Blood oxygen at 93%. Velran's antennae quivered. "This is unsustainable. Human physiology should not tolerate such metabolic strain for any extended period." He glanced sharply at Caleb. "And yet, you remain conscious." Caleb cracked one eye open and gave a faint grin. "Barely. I feel like I got hit by a cargo hauler." "You are still coherent," Velran muttered, his voice laced with both disbelief and irritation. "At this level of hypermetabolic activity, most species would already be in cardiovascular shock." "Guess that's one of the perks of being human," Caleb rasped, though his voice wavered under the strain. "We've got, redundancy built in." He coughed into his arm, the sound deep and rattling. Velran's triangular pupils narrowed. "Redundancy? Your body is exhibiting signs of catastrophic systemic stress. There is nothing redundant about this." Zariah interrupted softly, pointing to the holographic display. "Doctor, his hypothalamus is driving the elevated temperature. It appears deliberate, not a failure." Velran frowned, leaning closer to the projection of Caleb's neural activity. The thermoregulatory center in his hypothalamus was glowing brightly, a clear signal of intentional activation. "This is adaptive," Velran said, his tone dubious. "Yeah, Doc," Caleb mumbled, propping himself up weakly on one elbow. "It's called a fever. Burns out the bugs, like a self-cleaning oven." Velran turned to him, antennae stiff. "Your body is overheating to eradicate the pathogen." "Bingo," Caleb said, giving a weak thumbs up before collapsing back onto the platform. Zariah tilted her head, studying the display. "Doctor, his white blood cell count is elevated nearly 3 times baseline. Lymphocytes are proliferating, and macrophages are actively clearing damaged tissue. His immune system is working." Velran's segmented fingers twitched in frustration. "Working? This is chaos. His body is prioritizing immune activation at the expense of systemic stability. If his metabolic demands exceed his energy reserves..." Caleb cut him off with a hoarse laugh. Yeah, if I run out of gas, I crash. But I won't. I've done this before." Velran froze, his pupils contracting sharply. "You have survived this condition previously." "Sure," Caleb said, though he grimaced as he shifted uncomfortably. "Couple years ago, I had a fever so bad I thought my fridge was an air conditioner. Spent an hour sitting in front of it before I realized it wasn't plugged in." Velran's antennae flared in exasperation. This is not an anecdote to take pride in, human. You are describing catastrophic thermoregulatory dysfunction as though it were a minor inconvenience. Look, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a tired rasp, I get that this looks bad to you, but trust me, my body knows what it's doing. Velran rounded on Zariah. Prepare intravenous fluids and glucose supplementation. His metabolic reserves are already depleting, and dehydration will accelerate his decline. Caleb weakly raised a hand. No IVs, Doc. I don't need M. Velran's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unyielding. You do not need hydration when your body is exhibiting systemic overheating. I'm telling you, Caleb said, his eyes half-lidded. Interfering with the fever just messes with the process. Let it run its course. Zariah hesitated, glancing at Velran. Doctor, his temperature has plateaued at 40.3. It hasn't risen for several minutes. Velran stiffened, his triangular pupils narrowing as he studied the display. Plateaued. Yes, Zariah confirmed. His hypothalamus is maintaining the fever but not escalating it further. His immune markers are still rising, and his viral load sheet tapped the holographic console, magnifying the data. It's dropping. Velran leaned closer, his antennae twitching. Dropping. Rapidly, Zariah said. The fever appears to be driving a coordinated immune response. His leukocyte activity is spiking, and the macrophages are efficiently clearing infected tissues. Velran straightened, his posture tense. This level of inflammation should trigger multi-organ failure. His cardiovascular system should collapse under the strain. And yet Zariah said softly, gesturing to the vitals display, it hasn't. Caleb raised a weak hand and wagged a finger in Velran's direction. Told you, humans don't quit easy. Velran glared at him, his segmented fingers curling into fists. This is not quitting, this is biological recklessness bordering on suicidal. Caleb chuckled faintly, though it ended in a cough. Call it what you want, Doc. All I know is, it works. The medical bay of the Luminara was bathed in sterile blue light as Caleb Marner's condition reached its apex. His flushed skin glistened with sweat, his chest rising and falling in shallow but steady breaths. Above him, the monitors displayed a symphony of alarms and escalating metrics. Core temperature now at 40.7 degrees Celsius. Zariah reported quietly, her antennae pressed flat against her scalp, heart rate holding at 138 beats per minute, blood oxygen at 91%. Doctor, his reserves are nearly depleted. Velran's antennae twitched sharply as he stared at the holographic displays. This is unsustainable. His body cannot continue compensating at this rate. He turned to the medics nearby, prepared to initiate aggressive cooling. If his temperature rises further. No, Caleb croaked suddenly, his voice hoarse but insistent. He opened one bleary eye and shot Velran a weak grin. Don't mess with it, told you. The fever's doing its job. Velran rounded on him, his segmented fingers curling in frustration. Human, your vital signs indicate imminent systemic failure. Your thermoregulatory mechanisms are. Letting my immune system kick butt, Caleb interrupted, though his words were slurred. Trust me, Doc, this isn't my first rodeo. Dr. Zariah interjected softly, his hypothalamus is still maintaining the fever. The temperature isn't climbing further. It's holding steady. Velran turned sharply toward her, his pupils narrowing. And that is supposed to be reassuring? His inflammatory markers are beyond critical thresholds. But his system isn't collapsing, Zariah pointed out. She tapped a section of the holographic display. Look here, his cytokine production is spiking, but his macrophages are keeping up with the cellular debris. There's inflammation, yes, but it's controlled. Velran hissed softly in disbelief. Controlled? This is a biological wildfire. His system is gambling everything on brute force, as though redundancy can replace precision. And yet Zariah murmured, tilting her head toward Caleb, it is working. Velran turned back to Caleb, who gave him a feeble thumbs up. Seriously, Doc, Caleb rasped, his voice barely audible. Just give it a little more time. You'll see. Velran hesitated, his antennae twitching as he glanced between Caleb and the displays. If his reserves deplete further, his organs will begin shutting down. This is not a strategy, it is a gamble. Caleb coughed weakly, the sound rattling in his chest, but his grin remained intact. It's not gambling if you win. Velran's jaw tightened. Your hubris is intolerable. The tension in the medical bay had eased, though the room was still bathed in the soft glow of monitors. Caleb's condition had plateaued, then slowly begun to improve. His temperature was down to 39.5 day GC, his heart rate had dropped to 120, and his oxygen levels had stabilized at 94%. Zariah leaned over the console, her copper antennae twitching as new data populated the holograms. Core temperature continues to decline, she said. Inflammatory markers are falling, and his viral load is almost undetectable. Velran stood beside her, his segmented fingers steepled as he glared at the monitors. He is recovering. Yes, Zariah confirmed. His immune response has cleared the infection. Cellular repair processes are accelerating. It appears she hesitated, then continued. It appears his body is returning to homeostasis. Velran's antennae twitched sharply as he turned to Caleb, who was now sitting up on the platform, a hydration pack in one hand and a lopsided grin on his face. Told you, Caleb rasped, his voice still rough but undeniably smug. Piece of cake. Velran's triangular pupils contracted. You endured a fever that would liquefy the tissues of most species. Your cardiovascular system was strained to its absolute limits. Your survival is not a triumph, it is a statistical aberration. Caleb raised his hydration pack like a toast. To statistical aberrations. Zariah's lips curved faintly, her gaze flicking between Velran and Caleb. Doctor, perhaps this is why humans endure. Their biology may be chaotic, but it is remarkably robust. Velran stiffened, his antennae folding tightly against his scalp. Robust? This process was inefficient, wasteful, and reckless. A precise system would not require such an exorbitant expenditure of resources. Yet Caleb said, sliding off the diagnostic platform with a wince, but a precise system wouldn't survive on Earth. Back home, everything's out to get you bacteria, viruses, predators, weather, you name it. So we don't rely on perfect plans. We just make sure we can take a hit and keep going. Zariah tilted her head thoughtfully. Doctor, perhaps their chaos is their strategy. They have evolved to endure uncertainty by sacrificing efficiency for adaptability. Velran stared at her, his triangular pupils narrowing. You are suggesting that we abandon precision in favor of chaotic redundancy. No, Zariah said carefully, but perhaps we can learn from their resilience. Adaptability can be a strength when precision fails. Velran turned back to Caleb, who was now stretching lazily, his movements still sluggish but clearly recovering. Your species is irrational, he muttered, and yet, you endure. Caleb grinned. Thanks, Doc. I'll take that as a compliment. The medical bay had grown quiet, save for the soft hum of monitors and the occasional shuffle of medics as they tidied up. Caleb Marner, now showered and wearing a clean shirt, leaned casually against a console. He sipped from a hydration pack, his color restored and his breathing steady. Across the room, Velran and Zariah stood by the holographic diagnostic display, their antennae angled in what could only be described as skeptical contemplation. Final readings are normalizing, Zariah said, her coppery antennae twitching as she scanned the display. Core temperature, 37.8. Heart rate, 92. Oxygen saturation, 98%. Doctor, his inflammatory markers are barely elevated. Velran's segmented fingers clicked rhythmically against the edge of the console. Barely elevated, he muttered. His system endured hours of catastrophic stress. This level of recovery should not be possible without significant residual damage. Guess I'm just built tough, Caleb called over, flashing a grin. Velran shot him a glare. Your cavalier attitude remains intolerable, human. Caleb shrugged, raising his hydration pack like a toast. Hey, I'm just saying, not bad for someone who was supposedly about to liquefy, huh? Zariah stifled a smile and returned to the display. Doctor, his cellular repair mechanisms are extraordinary. Mitochondrial activity is surging, and oxidative stress markers are declining rapidly. Of course they are, Velran muttered, folding his segmented arms. Humans appear to treat systemic failure as a mere inconvenience. Not a failure, Caleb said, setting his hydration pack down and standing with a slight stretch. It's just how we roll. You get sick, you recover, you move on. Your species does not recover, Velran snapped. You survive through biological anarchy. Your processes lack precision, waste resources, and rely on sheer brute force. There is no strategy here, only desperation. Caleb scratched his head, pretending to mull that over. Yeah, but it works, doesn't it? Velran's antennae twitched sharply, and he turned away, muttering something under his breath. Zariah stepped closer to Caleb, her expression more curious than irritated. Human, your resilience is remarkable. But surely such chaos has limits. What happens when your system cannot keep up? Caleb gave her a half smile, his voice softening. Then we adapt. Or we try again. That's the thing about humans, we don't stop just because something doesn't work the first time. Zariah tilted her head thoughtfully. Doctor, she said, glancing at Velran, perhaps this redundancy is not chaos, but preparation. Humans endure by accounting for failure. Velran stiffened, his triangular pupils narrowing. You are romanticizing recklessness, Zariah. This is not preparation, it is an evolutionary gamble. Caleb folded his arms and leaned back against the console. You say gamble, I say insurance policy. Back on Earth, nothing ever goes perfectly. We don't plan for perfection, we plan for when things go wrong. Velran turned to face him fully, his pale blue skin darkening to a faint lavender. And what happens when every contingency fails? When your so-called redundancy collapses under its own inefficiency? Then we get up and try again, Caleb said simply. That's the difference between us, Doc. You think failure is the end. For us, it's just part of the process. The room fell silent. Even Zariah seemed to pause, her antennae tilting slightly as she considered his words. Velran's segmented fingers flexed, and he exhaled sharply. An irrational philosophy for an irrational species. And yet Zariah said quietly, they endure. Later. The common area of the Luminara was quiet as Caleb sprawled in a chair, munching on a nutrient bar he'd somehow smuggled aboard. Zariah approached, carrying a portable console. Human Marner, she said, sitting across from him. Caleb raised an eyebrow. You can call me Caleb, you know. No need to be all formal. Zariah hesitated, her coppery antennae twitching. Very well, Caleb. I wish to ask you something. Shoot. She gestured toward her console, which displayed a holographic model of human physiology. Your recovery has challenged much of what we know about biology. Our systems are designed to avoid failure, while yours seem to embrace it. Why? Caleb took a bite of his bar, chewing thoughtfully. Because failure's not the enemy. It's just another step forward. Back on Earth, we've had to deal with everything from pandemics to predators to plain old bad luck. If we tried to be perfect, we'd have died out ages ago. So instead, we built systems that bend without breaking. Zariah nodded slowly. Flexibility over rigidity. Exactly, Caleb said, pointing his bar at her. You get it. Velran's voice cut in from behind them. You are glorifying inefficiency again, Zariah. The chief medical officer approached, his antennae stiff and his posture rigid. Human systems are not superior because they adapt to failure. They are merely fortunate to survive their own chaos. Caleb grinned. You keep saying fortunate like it's a bad thing. Velran glared at him, then turned to Zariah. Document your observations. There is much to be learned, even if only to avoid replicating such reckless designs. He turned to leave but paused at the doorway, glancing back at Caleb. Your survival remains improbable, human. But perhaps there is value in understanding it. With that, he swept out of the room. Caleb watched him go, then leaned toward Zariah. He totally likes me. Zariah's lips curved faintly. I wouldn't go that far. Caleb shrugged, taking another bite of his bar. Give it time.